Hello, welcome to ASPI's Strategic Vision 2020. I'm your host for the evening, Stan Grant. Tonight we're looking at Europe, the future of Europe. Of course, in recent years, there have been no shortage of books or articles proclaiming the end of Europe or the death of Europe. The dream of European Union has been tested, of course, by Brexit, of rising nationalism, political populism, and some say even a resurgent fascism. Countries like Hungary and Poland have taken a harder right turn that's giving rise to claims of illiberal democracy. Anti-immigration sentiment has seen a return to harder borders. And of course, there has been ongoing deep economic problems in various countries, including the likes of Greece. At the same time, Russia looms very large. What to do with China, a question that is occupying the minds of countries all around the world, the future of NATO and the American alliance, and of course, the devastating impact right across Europe of COVID-19. There's a lot to talk about. We'll be taking some of your questions and comments throughout this discussion, and we'll try to include some of those as well. But to dissect all of this, we are very privileged to have the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. Good to see you. I'm glad you could join us.
Glad to be to be with you.
Now, I just wanted to start with how life is at the moment. Of course, Sweden has attracted so much attention during the coronavirus crisis because of the very different approach it has taken. What's your assessment so far, and just the feeling of life there in Sweden throughout this?
Well, I haven't been to Sweden for a month, I have to confess. I'm in Southern Europe at the moment, been to Italy, now I'm in the Balkans. But it's true, Sweden took a different approach, and it's very difficult to compare countries. But if we compare ourselves with our Nordic neighbors, which are fairly similar societies in different ways, they took a different approach. And if you look at sort of mortality figures, deaths, we are in Sweden, I think, more than 2 or 3 times as much as them combined.
Yeah, I think it's over 5,000, I think, at the moment is the...
Sorry?
I think over 5,000 at the moment is the death toll.
We're over 5,000. We are approaching 6,000, although it has stabilized by now. So it's fairly bad from that point of view. The counter argument is, of course, that it's been sort of less of a hit on economy. I think that's debatable, but that remains to be seen. We have somewhat different structures of our economies. And of course, we avoided some of the sort of physical pains or social pains of a complete lockdown. We did have an element of lockdown, that has to be said. It was a completely laissez-faire. But the jury is out. I don't think we can say that the Swedish story was a success story, certainly not. I find it very difficult to find any success stories. I mean, we did, I think that countries in Europe that did worse. Belgium has horrible figures. That might be an accounting issue there as well. The UK is clearly at the moment the worst. If we look at Europe, their performance has been amazingly miserable, has to be said.
The approach very much was, and I think this was a term that was used, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. That Sweden was saying we must take a longer view of that. You touched the economy. Sweden's economy is still affected. I think it'll shrink by around about 5% this year. It's less though than other countries that are hard hit, such as Italy and Spain, but the UK. But if you look at this idea that it is a marathon, not a sprint, I suppose the gamble here is that in the longer term, Sweden's approach may be seen to have been right. You don't believe at this stage though that you can make any judgment.
I think it's too early. I'm not certain that Sweden will come out as one of the better ones here. The approach that the others took was to try to clamp down on it very heavily at the beginning with heavy lockdowns. That took numbers down very significantly if we compare it to Sweden. And that might make it easier for them to handle the sort of resurgence of cases that we are seeing. We are bound to see because you can identify them more easily. In Sweden, it was a somewhat different approach, and the argument was really that it's going to be difficult to get out of a lockdown. That's true. It is difficult to get out of a complete lockdown, and we see those difficulties here and there. But these things should be balanced. I mean, the Swedish economy is somewhat less hit, as you say, if you compare to Southern Europe. That has to a large extent to do that we are, for reasons I would not go into. We are not that big in terms of tourism, as is sort of Italy, Spain, Greece, but that sector has been heavily hit. We are extremely dependent on the export markets, which means that sort of I think we're going to be roughly as much hit as others.
I was reading an article that you wrote about coronavirus. It's very interesting, and you were looking at why it was different this time, and you're comparing it to SARS in 2003, which of course wasn't as virulent or as widespread. But you made a couple of points. You said in 2003, China was slow to respond. Well, yes, it was slow to respond again this time as well. COVID, you acknowledge, is more virulent. The world is more interconnected. I think that's really critical. But here's the one I want to drill down on, which I think is really fascinating. You say it's geopolitics have played a role here, a lack of leadership, international cooperation, America abdicating its leadership. Of course, there were China-America tensions going into this. To what extent is coronavirus, the response to it, the impact of it, a result of those tensions and accelerating those tensions that were already there?
I think all of those factors accelerated it. I made an attempt to sort of dive into the question, why did we succeed with SARS? Why did we fail this time? It's easy to blame China. China messed it up with SARS in the beginning. You might argue that they messed it up with COVID in the beginning. I would say that they messed it up even more with SARS than with COVID. It was a quicker response in China, although certainly more perfect. Then it happens to be more contagious in this particular case. Then connectivity. I have a figure, I forgot it, but I think that we had sort of the number of direct flights we had between Wuhan and China and Wuhan and Europe was quite large. Go back in the SARS period, I don't think anyone was flying anything to Wuhan, to take that as an example. So connectivity played a part. And then geopolitics. Go back to Ebola, which I vividly remember, where we had the outbreak of that. And we had sort of, it was difficult in the beginning as well to identify it. But we had sort of a very strong push by the US and US leadership. With President Obama at the time, we had the Security Council, we had special meetings, we mobilized resources. They even sent military resources down to West Africa in this particular case. That was, of course, completely absent in this particular case. First, the US doesn't have any ambition of global leadership of that sort any longer. Secondly, they denied the problem for far too long. And there's no question that these factors added to all of the other factors in making this particular pandemic far worse than anything that we've seen in modern times.
Let's look at some of the geopolitical implications and the political landscape leading into this. I want to work through China, of course, you've mentioned, and the United States, but let's just stick with Europe. Right now, coronavirus means that our borders are our salvation. In fact, your ability to control the spread of the disease, the ability of governments to clamp down, stop the movement of people is absolutely critical. But going into the coronavirus crisis, borders were front and center in Europe again, particularly in places like Hungary, the anti-immigration pushback. And so much of this has contributed to the idea that we are seeing the death of Europe, or the end of Europe, or the end of this grand idea of European Union. Where do you sit on that?
I think what we've seen during the last 2 weeks, or whatever it is by now, has been a demonstration to the contrary, that Europe, after some significant debates, no question about that, have come together on a very massive recovery and restructuring program, and way beyond anything that's been debated before. And if you contrast that to the handling that we had from the EU side, both the Greek, the Euro crisis, and the refugee crisis, where it stumbled for some time. In this particular time, which is a far deeper crisis, Europe came together much faster for much stronger response. Now, sort of, the jury's out. We'll see what kind of effect it's going to have. But there's no question that that was a fairly decisive response. In the beginning, as you pointed out, it was different, because the first reaction of national governments was to put up borders and barriers. For the movement of people, you could understand that to a certain extent. But we did have a problem with the partial breakdown of the single market, the sort of integrated market, with deliveries of medical goods and whatever was needed between the different countries. The Commission was very strong on that and took action, and I think those problems, severe as they were overcome within a couple of weeks, and now we are clearly back to a functioning single market, which is extremely important for the functioning of the economy of every single of the countries.
It doesn't mean, and the circumstances of coronavirus are certainly exceptional. It doesn't mean that those tensions go away, though, does it? That the pushback against refugees, immigration, questions of sovereignty that lie at the heart of the Brexit decision, for instance, are still there. To what extent does that pull at the idea or test the idea of this integration or European unity?
No, you're right. I mean, that's always got to be there. We should not forget that Europe, or the EU at the moment, 27 countries at the moment, it used to be 28, as you point out. I mean, these nations have been shaped by histories over centuries, sometimes more than centuries, sometimes even thousands of years.
And violent history often.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every single border of Europe has been sort of drawn in blood over a fairly long period. And there are significant differences between the political cultures and outlooks and strategic whatever in the different countries. Overcoming this is a step-by-step approach, respecting the differences that are there. And that we've seen. And then we are sort of exposed to the outside world in different ways. I mean, Spain looks at Latin America with different eyes than Finland, and Finland or Lithuania looks at Russia with slightly different eyes than Portugal for fairly obvious reasons. And in terms of refugees, I mean, we now have a situation where, again, we have hundreds of people arriving every day in the south of Italy, coming from the breakdown of Libya and problems in Tunisia and whatever. But they're not arriving in Latvia, and they're not arriving in Ireland. So this is a constant enterprise to get the policies working together. At the same time as there is, I mean, I can look back on some experience over the decades with this, there's an increased recognition by every single government in Europe that however messy it is, and however messy the outside world is, and however challenging it is, we can't handle them on our own. I mean, the Brits might be under that illusion for a while, but it's being said that sort of all Europe is divided into two categories: the small countries in the world today and those countries that do not yet recognize that they are small in the world today. And it's only by acting together that we can have any sort of ability to master our future. We are not surrounded by huge oceans as some other nations are.
You're right in identifying the difficulties of acting alone, and there has been great strength in that unity. But at the same time, decisions that are made certainly have consequences for other nations, because you share borders and you share a continent. They become very, very deeply political issues. And let's look, for instance, at Germany's decision to allow the influx of refugees, which certainly drew a response from the likes of Hungary, which took a very different approach. Perhaps that was also something that fueled a resurgence of the right, Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, as well, that had a significant increase in its political support. So that ability to live side by side, where decisions made, particularly by large nations like Germany or France, are going to have enormous consequences, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you are right. If you could look back to the autumn of 2015, the refugee crisis, what Hungary did, in all fairness, was that the refugees arriving in Hungary, they put them on buses to Austria, all of them. And the Austrians did, very heroically, was to put them on buses to Germany. And Germany was then faced with the issue whether one should more or less mobilize the entire police force to stop them at the border or let them in. And Angela Merkel took the decision to let them in a rather unique situation. That's still controversial. And as you said, it transformed the politics of Germany for some time. But that is by now 5 years ago. And we are on our way, I think, gradually towards having a more unified European approach to migration, although it is difficult, as long as we don't have the complete control of our borders. We are beefing up the common European I shouldn't call it a European border force because it's really an augmentation force for the national forces that are there. But they are recruiting 10,000 new persons at the moment in order to help, say, Greece or help Italy or the other countries that are exposed to it, and then a scheme to handle the migration that we need. And the pressure of refugees that is there due to the fact that we are living in a part of the world where we see significant meltdowns, be that North Africa, be that Sahel, be that Syria, be that the Middle East, be that Afghanistan. I mean, we can't change location.
Has that, though, hardened right-wing politics across Europe? While you say in Germany that initial crisis may have been dealt with, the right has made enormous strides across Europe. And if you look at countries like Hungary and Poland as well, where there's been significant success, how do you characterize that right now and the strength of a more hardline right-wing politics?
Well, it's less of an issue now than it was a couple of years ago. I mean, you're entirely right pointing at Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland, for example, and there are other Hungary is another case. But if you look overall at the performance of these sort of extreme right-wing parties, they've not been particularly successful during the last year or two, and particularly the Corona crisis has altered the landscape. What we saw prior to the Corona crisis was that the significant forces that were rising were really the green forces. I mean, the climate issue took over the refugee issue to a large extent as the one that was driving, I wouldn't say realignment of politics, but new parties emerging and sort of fringe parties increasing. What we've seen in the Corona crisis has been the resurgence of the main parties to a large extent. I mean, people have said, well, it's all right to be against refugees and it's all right to say that everything is about the climate, but in a situation like this, you need somewhat more, let's call it adult leadership. And at the moment, that's where we are. Where will we be 1 year or 2 years down the line remains to be seen. Clearly, we have more fluidity in the European political landscape than we had before, and we have an increasing fragmentation of the political landscape in the different countries, which makes governance somewhat more difficult because it's more coalition governments everywhere, and coalition UK is the exception that has to do more with the election system, and coalition governance is sometimes an art that has not been developed to the full in all countries.
I want to look strategically across Europe as well, and in terms of security. You've written, and others have raised this prospect as well, ending with a question mark, of course, end of NATO. What's your assessment of the strength of NATO right now, its future? Perhaps some prematurely we're seeing the ends of it with that tension between the US and NATO and Donald Trump's pushback. But where do you assess that right now?
I think first we have, of course, a Trump factor. How long we'll have the Trump factor? Are we going to have it for some months? Are we going to have it for a further 4 or 5 years? That we don't know. But there is no doubt that Mr. Trump is not a fan of NATO and wants to shrink the US contribution to the collective defense of the NATO members and all of Europe, by the way. If the Trump factor disappears the one way or the other, but by election, I mean, at some point in time, we still have the China factor. In the sense that I think the US will, whatever happens, they will sort of intellectually, politically, and militarily be far more committed to balancing, or however you confront, or whatever phrase you want to use, the rising power of China. And that means that the resources that will be available to the rest of the world, be that the Middle East or Europe, will be less. And accordingly, Europe will have to look more to being able to mobilize its own resources for its own territorial defense. That's going to be one of the big issues in the years ahead.
You mentioned the Trump factor. We'll talk about Donald Trump in America a little bit more in just a moment, but there's also the Putin factor, isn't there?
Yes, there is, absolutely. Or the Putin factor really was helped the resurrection of NATO. I mean, go back in time and remember, NATO, of course, during the Cold War was fairly obvious what it was doing. It was defending a line going right through Germany, by the way. And there was a massive Soviet forces. I mean, there was in East Germany, should not forget it, 19 divisions, 500,000 Soviet soldiers. So that was fairly clear cut. Then came the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the phrase with NATO was that it has to be out of area or out of business. That is, if you're not active in the rest of the world, there's nothing to do in Europe, and then NATO is gone. And that was the age of all sorts of the Balkan intervention, notably Afghanistan later on. Now, with Putin, the territorial defense issues in Europe are back. The fact that we now have NATO forward deployed battle groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, a multinational such, that was absolutely unthinkable prior to 2014. Absolutely unthinkable. It wasn't on the radar screen. But now it's seen as absolutely essential. So NATO is in that sense back in the core business of territorial defense of Europe due to what Putin did in Ukraine in 2014.
Vladimir Putin would argue differently. He has argued differently. He would say that it was NATO expansion in the 90s, after the end of the Soviet Union, the push eastward that precipitated that Russia was acting in a defensive manner, as particularly issues like Ukraine. When you look at that, does he have a point? And when you look at that expansion in the 90s, do you reassess that?
No, he doesn't have a point. I mean, NATO was very careful after the expansion of NATO and the enlargement of NATO. And I think even in the Russian sort of moderate liberal strategic community, there was an understanding that this contributes to the stability. I mean, going back in historical terms, Central Europe, Eastern Europe has been a source of instability in between German power and Russian power. And the fact that it was anchored firmly in the West created a stability in the European landscape that was ultimately to the benefit of Europe, of Russia as well. So it doesn't have a point. And NATO did not forward deploy any multinational forces at all. There was nothing. There wasn't even, as a matter of fact, any sort of defense plans for these areas. All of this happened after Ukraine. And Ukraine was, as well as Georgia prior to that, that was an expression of the fact that sort of, particularly the Putin regime, hadn't really accepted the full dissolution of the Soviet Union. I think they had accepted that sort of German Democratic Republic was Germany. They had accepted that countries like Poland and Hungary also were independent. But the core Soviet, and they did swallow the independence of the Baltic States, I think. But they never fully accepted Ukraine as an independent state. And that is what ultimately led to the intervention decision that they took in the beginning of 2014, which I think was the historians will see as the biggest strategic mistake of Russia for a long time. I mean, losing the German Democratic Republic, yeah, that was bound to happen at some point in time. But losing the friendship of Ukraine is quite something from the Russian perspective.
Do you see you mentioned the Baltic States. Would you consider that a flashpoint right now, potentially?
Not at the moment. There's been a lot of speculation about that, not least in NATO circles, and sort of whether Russia has the military capability to quickly take over the Baltic States. Yeah, perhaps. Quickly. It's not going to be an easy affair, but I mean, perhaps. Why would they do that? As long as I think the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are firmly anchored in all of the European institutions, all of the transatlantic and European institutions, and as long as they have their internal cohesion under control or harmonious democratic control, I fail to see what Russia would gain, because such a Russian offensive into the Baltic states would trigger a European-wide and perhaps a worldwide conflict.
And of course, triggers Article 5. And I suppose at that point, the Baltic states, could they rely upon NATO in that event? Do you believe that Article 5 would be upheld?
I think they could, and primarily for the reason that any such Russian move doesn't make sense in itself. So it would be seen and would probably be part of a bigger Russian move in other directions as well. And that means that it would bring in automatically other countries, either directly or indirectly, and that they would fear. Russia would clearly have to move into Ukraine, which is a big operation to do. Might be Poland would immediately feel threatened, no question about that. With Poland is threatened, Germany is in play. So the ripple effect of such an operation would undoubtedly trigger Article 5, and I don't think the Americans can stand aside from that.
Has this increased discussion again in Sweden about potentially joining NATO? That's an active, ongoing discussion. But where is that right now?
It has triggered that discussion. It's not particularly active at the moment because our Social Democratic government at the moment, and the Social Democratic government or the Social Democratic Party was very much sort of the custodian of the policy of neutrality during the Cold War and had an element of even ideological neutrality and shouldn't even touch security cooperation with the West. Under this government, they've gone full-fledged to security cooperation with the West. So far as they are motivating decisions on how we allocate forces from the perspective of how they are best shaped in order to receive the help that we expect coming from the Americans or coming from the rest. So it's a functional cooperation with NATO and with the US in security terms that have made the discussion about membership somewhat less acute. I've said that I think we will be members of NATO within 10 years. I think that's still the case, but it's of course dependent upon quite a number of factors.
We had a question coming through a little bit earlier, and it does relate to this to some extent. But the question was that given your population, around 10 million, that Sweden has a very strong defence industry, and whether there were lessons here for Australia, which of course is increasing its military spending right now, embarking on a submarine program.
Well, Sweden built up a fairly strong defense industry, not on everything, but we've been we are, if you look at the size of the country, we are quite amazing. We build sort of very advanced fighter aircraft. We build among the best submarines in the world. And we are very good in electronics, electronic warfare, electronic offensive, and things. It takes decades. This was something that was started in the 1940s for obvious reasons, when we were outside of the war and had to build up our forces. And after the Second World War, we decided, under the impact of the Korean War and other events, the division of Europe, to continue. So it was a build-up during the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then we tried to sort of maintain it and develop it and make it more international in its outlook and its approach. So it's possible if you decide to concentrate on a couple of sectors that are absolutely critical to you, and if you have the long-term commitment to do it. And then one of the factors that did contribute is, of course, that we didn't think that we could buy the things from other countries that were suitable to us, because the equipment that was produced for the Americans, say, was geared for another kind of warfare, than another kind of environment than we were facing.
Yeah, which said recently by our Prime Minister in announcing the changes to our defence strategy here and the increased spending, that we live in a poorer, more dangerous and disordered world. And of course that looks very specifically at China, the United States, South China Sea as well. We've seen stronger statements coming from the United States and Australia in terms of China's legal claim to the South China Sea. What can we expect from Europe?
I think it's unrealistic to expect Europe to be sort of made or significant military hard security player in that part of the world. So I just see, to take that as an example. What you will see, I think, is sort of demonstrations of presence by the French or the Brits or the others, with sort of naval visits now and then, and sort of sailing through the South China Sea in order to demonstrate the political point. But that's not really the same as being able to contribute substantial military forces. I think the European sort of hard power security attention will be focused on the widely defined near abroad that we have, which is sort of problematic enough. But strong political strategic support to the position taken by notably Australia, by the way, a lot of commonality in strategic outlook between Australia and the European countries.
Would there be a stronger language required in terms of messaging to China about its assertiveness or pushing back against those legal claims that China says it has to those islands?
I think we have been. I mean, the fact that there was an international court expressing itself on
which China ignored,
which China ignored. I think that was highly significant. And what we've seen lately is, of course, that the US has come around to accepting the position taken by that international tribunal, which is important. And I think it's very important. You can use hard language in Brussels or Washington, but we have to take into consideration also the interests of the countries that are in the region itself. I've been in a dialogue with ASEAN countries and those that are more closely affected by it. Is very important to give them support in the approach that they take.
What role does Europe and of course, when I speak about Europe, it's I'm looking at it as a whole, notwithstanding the fact that individual countries make up their own decisions and have their own relationships, but more broadly, in terms of the increasing tension between China and the United States, the trade war, the rhetoric which is certainly ramped up. What role does Europe play, the EU play, in either bridging that divide, or what choices does it force the EU to make?
I think that's got to be one of the big issues in the next year. I mean, it was planned anyhow to be a big year for the EU-China relationship. We have the German presidency of the EU this particular half year, and there were plans for a big summit between all of the EU leaders and the Chinese leadership in Leipzig, Germany, in September. That's obviously been cancelled, but still China looms big, and there's an element of American, let's call it pressure or whatever, in order to align with a somewhat more hardline approach that they have taken. That won't happen. What is going to happen is that Europe is going to develop its own approach, and there are going to be two pillars to that. I mean, there's going to be the confrontation on all of the issues where we disagree. That could be the legalities on issues like the South China Sea, or the extreme concern that are expressed on Hong Kong, or the human rights issues, as we see them developing in China. I think that will loom larger. We also have significant trade and economic tensions. We have ongoing negotiations. I think they've been going on for 7 years by now on an investment protection treaty, and that's the hope to finalize that. I think that talks underway, high-level talks, as a matter of fact, today. I hope to finalize that by this year. But then we have issues of need of cooperation with China, notably, I would say, the climate issues. Next year, we have the COP26 coming up in UK towards the end of the year. And that is really sort of, now it's up to show if we mean what we said in Paris when we signed that particular agreement or not. And if we're going to be effective, or even sort of marginally effective on the climate issues, we can't do it without the Chinese. We can't do it without the Indians either, by the way.
You have to do it without the Americans, of course, under Donald Trump. Well, he pulled out. If he's re-elected, that will follow through.
That's going to be extremely bad, because how will we convince the Chinese and the Indians to take those two, because those are very, very major emitters, to undertake substantial measures if the Americans are doing nothing? That's going to be extremely hard. And if the entire sort of process collapses, where are we in terms of climate change? With an increasing recognition that this is a problem with also security implications for all of our countries. If we have a new American administration coming in with sort of a Biden presidency, with rejoining Paris, it's not going to be by the hood and apple pie immediately. US is a big place. To turn that around takes some time. But going back to the China issues, I mean, China is roughly or nearly a third of global emissions. And the commitment that they had in Paris was, of course, that they shouldn't increase them until 2030. But I mean, after that, there's a need to go for substantial reductions in China and substantial reductions in India. That has direct implications for their economic development plans in terms of energy supplies and coal-fired power stations and all of that, sort of wherever they got the coal from, by the way. So here we have an acute need for a link with the Chinese, in spite of the fact that we will have the disagreements on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, human rights, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and all of that. We have to be able to do both. That recognition ain't really there in the US debate. If you listen to the Pompeo speech at the Nixon Center the other day, which I'm sure you did with the tension in Australia, it wasn't much of a strategy. It was more a crusade. And whether that is going to be sufficient, I don't think you will find very many Europeans.
Well, it is an election year. To what extent do you put down that rhetoric to electioneering?
Well, there's an element of that, undoubtedly. But I think it's unwise to have the US Secretary of State being a campaign manager. Because there's, of course, a risk that the world is listening to what he says and misunderstands it and thinks that it's actually a foreign policy. And what effect that sort of speech is going to have on internal Chinese decision making, I don't know. But I'm not quite certain they're going to be positive from our point of view.
You mentioned some of the areas where there are difficulties. Something that's been framed already as a technology war, and something that directly involves Sweden, of course, with Ericsson, other big European companies like Nokia, but Huawei, of course, being central to this. What are your views on Huawei and its involvement in the rollout, particularly of 5G technology? I know that Sweden rolled out 5G technology that did involve some Huawei component. Sweden has tighter restriction laws, but does not say that that's directed against any particular country. Different nations in Europe are making up their own minds. We know that Australia has, Huawei is still operating here, but not involved in 5G rollout. How do you navigate that, given the sensitivities and given the response that we see from China when they see anything attempt to block Huawei as an insult to the Chinese Communist Party?
There's going to be an increasingly difficult issue for all of our countries. We've been in the sort of front line, or whatever you call it, of this for quite some time, because as you said, Huawei has, which is also a very competent company in terms of technology, no question about that. I think Ericsson and Nokia are still in the technology lead, but Huawei is catching up, and it's not only stealing technology, there's an element of that, but it's not only that. We have to be fair. We also have to recognize that a company like Ericsson, I mean, one of his, for a long time, his largest single market was China, building up sort of the 3G and the 4G systems of China, which was a good thing to do. Development is a good thing and all over the world. And they have still significant research facility in China, not for the absolute high end, that's been kept in Sweden, but elsewhere. So it's been a relationship that's been there for quite some time, and we have been very deeply aware of the security aspects of that long before that became an issue on the US political agenda. I think it is naive to think that you can disengage technologically completely from China, but you have to be aware of the security implications of all of the technologies that you import and that you handle. And you have to build up your own security or cyber defenses of different sorts and the cyber resilience of your entire society and economy, and be much more aware of that. But the Chinese are investing heavily in different cyber technologies. But apart from the state investment that is there, I think we should acknowledge that there's an impressive level of digital entrepreneurship in Chinese society as well. Sort of Alibaba wasn't created by the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Huawei certainly has its support and security implications of that, but this is going to be an extremely tricky balancing factor as we go forward.
You've described Australia as a canary in the coal mine. It's a phrase I've read elsewhere as well when it comes to relations with China, of course, and very much at the hinge point of those big power tensions between the United States and China. Do you believe it has made Australia more vulnerable because there has been this dependence on China, certainly economically?
Well, I've called Australia a canary in the coal mine for two reasons. I mean, first, sort of China. There's no sort of Western democracy, I think, that is so dependent upon China in economic terms in different ways. And secondly, sort of the climate issues. Obviously, we saw that last year or beginning of this year as well. I mean, the effect that climate change is having on Australia.
With the bushfires, of course, but you could also look at the Pacific and the impact there, which ultimately is going to be an impact on Australia as well.
True, absolutely. But whenever I go to Australia, I wouldn't say it's that often, but it does happen. I notice that the entire debate is just China and climate. That's it. And those issues, both of those issues, have been looming larger in Australia than in most European countries for quite some time. That means that we have something to learn from the experience of Australia.
What do you have to learn? Are you critical of Australia's response thus far? I mean, I know there's been a lot of criticism from Europe to Australia for climate change policy. Of course, not forgetting that coal is, I think, our biggest export and certainly a big employer, mining a big employer in Australia. So there are deep economic issues to be considered in any climate change response.
Yeah, true. There have been sort of European question marks concerning sort of climate policies pursued by Australian governments now and then. I mean, it's been sort of, as you know better than me, these have been controversial issues in the politics of Australia. But clearly Europe takes a more forward-leaning position on climate than Australia has been able to do, and that is regrettable. Whether this is shifting in Australia, that remains to be seen. On China, you have an economic dependence, and it's a question of sort of balancing that. You have sort of the coal you mentioned and other exports. You are a commodity exporter to a large extent, supplying China. You've had the issue of all of the Chinese students, for better or worse. I mean, there are positive aspects of that as well, but I would hope that a lot of these Chinese students go back to China with a somewhat different view of the outside world and its values than they had when they arrived there. But it's clearly something that requires constant attention. And you've had, while we in Europe have, and the US as well, a discussion on sort of potential Russian meddling in our domestic affairs. Of course, you have a discussion on the Chinese meddling in your domestic affairs. So we have things to learn from each other.
It's interesting you mentioned China and Russia there, because there's something I think doesn't get enough attention, and that is the Sino-Russian Alliance. Two countries that have become very close to each other as China expands through Belt and Road, as China increasingly muscles up in the region. We saw the tensions with India just recently. We also see Russia's resurgent power in parts of the world like the Middle East. And that China and Russia are much closer now. What impact is that having? What's your assessment of the strength of that alliance and the challenges it poses?
Very good question, to which I don't think there is a satisfactory answer as of yet. I remember I was in Moscow, I think it was last year, for extensive discussions. And what I noted then was that there was a very different tonality to the debate than it was in, say, 2014-15, when Russia went into Ukraine and we had Western sanctions. There was a tendency by the Russians to say, we don't really care about you, we've got China. That's disappeared. There's now an awareness in Moscow that they are very much a junior partner. I mean, the economy of Guangdong province is much bigger than the economy of Russia. And they're also now beginning to see China that the technology is far more advanced than they are. So there's an apprehension. At the same time, both of them feel that they need each other in order to be sort of a strategic counterweight on the global stage to the Americans. India plays an important role here from the Russian point of view. It's become somewhat more complicated lately from the Chinese point of view. What is worrying from the European point of view is, of course, that if there were to be sort of an open conflict in the eastern part of the Eurasian continent, where the Americans will be dragged in, if they want it or not, then of course that could be the temptation for Russia to use that opportunity to do maneuvers in the western part of the Eurasian continent. So that is a sort of a long-term strategic worry that we have.
Does all of this feed into something that you've written about and something that Fareed Zakaria, the journalist and writer, has written about over a decade ago, and that is this post-American world? Is that what we're seeing here? To what extent then does that play into the decisions that Europe has to make?
Well, we see, I mean, we have seen a post-American world in the COVID crisis. I was very struck by what happened at the World Health Assembly of the World Health Organization in May, which is the highest decision-making body of that ministerial level, meets video, in this particular case, once a year. And of course, this was the number one global issue at the time. And we had America absent. We had China very active, assertive. And we had a Europe that was able to go in and be sort of the mediating force that could bridge the gap and forge a global consensus. So that to me was an indication of the world that we might be heading into if in a lot of other issues, if present American policies continue.
Well, you've written very bluntly, with Donald Trump in the White House, the age of American leadership is over. Is America no longer a reliable security partner?
Yeah, I can say that, but if you read the national security strategy that was out a year after they came into office or something like that, it is absent any ambitions to have a stable global system or something like that. I mean, the key phrase is sovereignty. They say the global system, global community doesn't exist for them. What exists is sort of sovereign states fighting with each other or competing with each other. That's the sort of basic philosophy of the national security strategy of the Trump administration. It's not any ambition to lead a coalition of democracies or others. It is the ambition to be strong in a battle between other sovereign states. That's it. And that is, of course, that was the theoretical underpinning for the policies that we saw in the COVID crisis. This
does predate Donald Trump, though, too, doesn't it? I mean, Barack Obama had made criticism of NATO and increasing call for NATO to increase spending, also Australia to increase defence spending, and he'd made comments then about America not being the global sheriff, if you like. America, of course, battered after 9/11 and the global financial crisis and endless war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
True, but it was very different. I mean, there was a recognition during the Obama period that the age of America being the global policeman and everything was probably over. But he wanted to sort of compensate this by building global alliances of different sorts. I mean, he was strong in alliance building. Efforts at alliance building, at multinational institutions of different sorts, security alliances of different sorts. That was the way of handling what he saw was the long-term relative decline of American power. While the Trump approach is very different indeed. He also says that the age of policemen is over. He couldn't care less about most of the world, as we know. But the approach is not to build global coalition, not to build alliances, not to build multinational structures, but to go it alone. So sort of underlying analysis, same, policy, very different.
I want to look at the Middle East as well, which, of course, you know, from our vantage point in Australia, perhaps we don't appreciate the extent to which this is a European issue. You touched on the flow of refugees from the conflicts in Syria, Libya, and elsewhere, and the impact that's had politically on Europe. But of course, Europe has a real stake in countries like Libya, for instance. Libya has been described as what a post-American world looks like. You know, Russia, Turkey, the EU states, European states as well, all involved in what is a power vacuum and a mess.
Yeah, that's probably a nice way of putting it at the moment. And you could, of course, add Syria to that particular list as well. And one has to recognize, I think, and I think the Americans learned that lesson in Iraq, that these places, to a certain extent in Afghanistan either, these places are so complicated that no nation on its own can go in there and fix everything. It requires sort of broad coalitions with significant endurance and strategic patience in order to achieve any results. If you don't have that, then you end up where we are now, with sort of different powers with competing agendas, with sometimes limited agendas. Sometimes the agenda can be only to show that we are there in order to be something, and a mess that goes from the one difficult situation to the other. I mean, Syria is still a very complicated place, needless to say. Iraq is extremely fragile, due also to the confrontation between the US and Iran. And Libya goes from bad to worse.
And the US and Iran, of course, walking away from that Iran deal that was brokered with European powers, goes to precisely the sort of issue that you raised about America being a reliable security partner. What this has done, hasn't it, is to increase Russia's role. Russia's using that as leverage elsewhere in the world. But if Russia is back anywhere, it is certainly back in the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya, Iran. Its influence there is so much greater now. Is that because of what you see as an abdication of American leadership?
Yes, partly, and partly because Russia have been playing its fairly weak hand rather well.
And ruthlessly.
Sorry?
And ruthlessly.
And ruthlessly, absolutely. But also with an element of sort of sophistication. I mean, the fact that Russia is now the country that is talking to everyone in the Middle East. US is not talking to everyone in the Middle East. US is talking to some of his friends and refuses to talk completely with others and is in confrontation with others. But Russia has managed to sort of be the sort of everyone goes to Moscow. Whether it produces that much, you can discuss, but they are there. So they are playing what is essentially weak hand still. Because I mean, the economic power of Russia in the Middle East is sort of marginal. Military influence, yeah, there is some, undoubtedly. But they made themselves central to both the Syria conflict, to the Libya conflict, and to others.
And of course, Turkey is central there as well. And Turkey is interesting as well because of its NATO membership, and also, you know, you have a situation where Turkey and France, for instance, both NATO members, are on different sides of a conflict in Libya, with Turkey supporting the government and France, accused of supporting the warlord Khalifa Haftar.
True. Turkey is, if you look at the immediate EU neighborhood, we have two large countries, somewhat different, but both very complicated and quite a challenge. I mean, we have Russia and we have Turkey. Turkey, of course, was on a European trajectory with accession negotiations with the European Union for quite some time. But the politics of the country has taken another turn. And it's been sort of dragged away from the European trajectory, and I think sort of sinking down sort of in the Middle East and trying to be a power holder and sort of power broker in that particular area with involvement, as you said, in Syria. I can understand that. There's a Turkish national interest. They have more Syrian refugees they have more refugees in Turkey than in any other country in the world. Only Istanbul has more Syrian refugees than the rest of Europe taken together. So, and you have the Kurdish issue as well. But then sort of lining up with Qatar in a complex battle for power in the Middle East. And then you had the Libya thing. So it gets very complicated, and also confrontation now with Greece and Cyprus over maritime rights on the continental shelves and energy issues in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we are approaching a situation with Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean that is exceedingly complex, and where Russia is playing the cards in order to be part of the game.
And big stakes as well, of course. I mean, financial big stakes with resource deposits there that clearly Greece would like to be able to share in.
Yes, the resource deposits are there, absolutely, and that's important. And that's why we see sort of the battle for the sort of the economic exclusive zones of the continental shelves in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the energy resources that might be there, both the resources and the pipeline routes, in order to supply the European markets with that. And we have also in the middle of this, we have, which I consider one of the biggest failure of international diplomacy in a generation, the fact that we've not been able to sort out the Cyprus issue. A conflict that really goes back to the 1960s, and then 1970s aggravated, and we still have UN forces in patrolling a dividing line right through a European capital city, and that sort of impacts the entire situation as well.
Yeah, and when you talk about UN forces, I mean, again, something that doesn't get anywhere near enough attention, and that's Africa, where you have strong UN peacekeeping in places like Democratic Republic of Congo. And if you look across the Sahel region, where France has long history and deep involvement, and you see there the resurgence and the resilience of militant groups that are driven out but come back and can occupy enormous parts, enormous territory.
That is true. And if I were to single out one area that is a long-term strategic concern to Europe, and that is somewhat off the radar screen, perhaps, it is the Sahel region, where we've seen a gradual deterioration of relations, in spite of sort of massive, as you point out, we have UN forces, we have EU forces, we have French forces, we have different coalition forces under French leadership, we have US special forces. But it's not that we are sort of winning the battle against the militant Islamic groups. They are in the ascendancy. And then we have significant governance problems in these countries, very poor countries, very poor governance. We have the strain of global warming, and we have the sort of the demographic explosion to a certain extent of certain of these countries. That's a very volatile mix that we need to handle, because what we've learned is that Sahara is vast, but it's not an ocean. What happens in, to take that phrase, what happens in Sahel doesn't stay in Sahel, and Europe is nearby. So that is a big source of concern.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and we've traversed so much of the globe. I wanted to finish with some thoughts on you on what sort of order do you think is going to emerge out of the disorder that we're seeing right now? Freedom House, which measures the strength of democracies, calls it a democratic recession and says we've seen the return of the strongman, that there have been 13 years now of declining freedom and democracy in the world. In China, there is an authoritarian, some say an authoritarian superpower that has a different model, an authoritarian capitalist model that other countries can now seek to emulate. Others have talked about entering into a new Cold War era, and now serious people are saying out loud the possibility of conflict, or conflict that we would have thought was unthinkable is now not so unthinkable. What order do you think we return to in a world where it is a post-American world to some degree? Russia, China, alliance, all of those things that I've outlined and we discussed. What emerges from this?
Well, I think our hope must be that there's some sort of order and not just disorder. At the moment, we are heading towards more of disorder. A multipolar world with increasing tensions between the different poles, and the risk, of course, that a small issue suddenly becomes a big conflict. That what was sort of for Sarajevo, what Sarajevo was for Europe in 1914, the Scarborough Shoal or the Spratleys might become for the world 1 or 2 decades down the road. That needs to be avoided by building structures of alliances and security dialogue, by alliance between the like-minded and democracies and whatever, obviously, but also security links and dialogues and understandings with adversaries. Because if we can't sort of handle peacefully adversaries, we end up in a somewhat different situation. And then we must handle the sort of big economic shifts underway in the world. On the trends that we saw prior to COVID, the Chinese economy in a couple of decades is going to be twice the size of the US economy. And the Indian economy is going to be the size of the European economy. And the Indonesian economy is going to be the fourth biggest economy in the world. That's a very different world. And add to that the transition to the digital technologies. Where are the commanding heights of the digital worlds? And how do we make certain that the benefits of that particular digital world brings both security and prosperity to as many as possible? So it's a challenging world, to put it in those terms.
Just a final thought from you then. Where is the leadership that navigates this world, and in an arm wrestle of authoritarianism and liberal democracy, who has the ascendancy?
Well, I think I happen to believe that liberal democracy is always in the ascendancy as a matter of principle, because I think that authoritarian regimes, they have short-term strength, but they have long-term weaknesses, always. I mean, that's been demonstrated throughout history, but I'm saying that with a reservation. Yes, there are periods when authoritarian regimes can for some time do well. I'm quite certain that China would have done even better with a more open and liberal regime. Look at Taiwan, look at Hong Kong, look at Singapore. Chinese people can do better than they do under communist regime, but the communist regime can last for quite some time. So I do believe in the long-term strength of liberal democracy. But then it's a question of building an order that is endurable and can bring the stable peace that is necessary. That's the challenge.
A challenge indeed. You've given us a lot to think about. Terrific to have spent this hour or so with you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, Carl Bildt. Thank you.